those who I haven't had the opportunity to meet, I am Dr. Frank Harris III, Professor of Post-Secondary Education at San Diego State University and co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, which I'll talk to you about in a few minutes. So today's webinar, the objectives are twofold. First, we're going to talk about the myriad of institutional factors and barriers that make it difficult to close equity gaps that impact disproportionately impacted students. And second, the majority of this workshop is going to focus on the strategies and practices that have proven effective in supporting disproportionately impacted students when enacted by classified professionals in an equity-minded way. As noted earlier, I am the founding co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, which is a research and practice center that I founded with my colleague, Dr. J. Luke Wood, at San Diego State in 2011. And our focus at SEAL is about partnering with community colleges to institutionalize equity efforts. And we do so by way of three primary objectives. We use assessment and inquiry to facilitate institutional capacity building within community colleges. We are also heavily involved in conducting and disseminating empirical research that focuses on historically underrepresented and underserved students in community colleges. And finally, we are engaged in professional learning experiences that have an intentional focus on building educators' capacity to be equity-minded and to employ equity-minded practices in their teaching and work with students. Now, some of you may be asking, why do we need to have a workshop that focuses exclusively on classified professionals? And in response to that question, I do want to offer these four reasons. First, we must understand that classified professionals in community colleges are more likely than any other educators to engage students during their first interactions on campus. So in many ways, classified professionals are shaping students' earliest experiences and early impressions of the campus and the environment in which they're going to be learning. Second, classified professionals provide frontline support and oftentimes encounter students during periods of crisis and anxiety and difficulty. And so if we are really heavily focused and intentionally focused on institutionalizing equity, then we have to recognize that it's classified professionals who in many ways are going to encounter students during the most critical time. And so, building their capacity to recognize signs of distress as it relates to equity and being able to act responsibly is really important in this regard. We also know that classified professionals are more likely than any other educators to share the racial ethnic backgrounds of diverse students. We recognize that educators of color are underrepresented in the faculty ranks as well as in the ranks of senior administration. And in many respects, it's classified professionals who share the backgrounds, particularly the racial ethnic backgrounds of disproportionately impacted students. And then this last point is really important, is we've known for a long time that classified professionals have been providing critical support to students that often go unnoticed and unrecognized. They're doing work for students and on behalf of students that exceeds and falls beyond their job descriptions and what they're actually compensated to do. Also, in this regard, to further underscore this point, Luke and I wrote a piece that appeared in the Huffington Post in 2015, in which we argued why it was necessary to invest in classified professionals if institutions were going to be successful in meeting its equity goals. And one of the key points we made in the piece was that students, and these were insights that were derived from our qualitative work, students often noted that it was classified professionals who were more likely than their faculty to engage with them and encourage them with messages such as, "You can do it, I'm proud of you, keep your head in the books," or ask them how they're doing. Simply stated, we can't rely exclusively on faculty or administrators to be responsible for building the relationships that are necessary to support students. Classified professionals have been doing this work for decades, and therefore it is important that colleges not only recognize this, but continue to build their capacity to do so. And as we transition into the content related to equity and equity mindedness, I always think it's critically important that we have some shared understanding of what it means. I know many of you, if you've been involved in any webinar or any presentations that I've led, that you've probably heard me talk about this several times. But I always think it's important to revisit it. First, we need to recognize that at its core, equity is about enacting intentional strategies to address disparities that impact students who experience disproportionate impact. That means students who are not benefiting from their participation in post-secondary education as much as other students. And we know from our work that there are groups that consistently experience disproportionate impact on almost every indicator of student success, notably the students that are represented here. I do want to highlight and acknowledge two things. First, this is by no means an exhaustive list. There's certainly other groups that easily can be presented here as experiencing disproportionate impact. And second, I recognize that there is a lot of intersectionality amongst the student groups that are represented here. So for example, we know that a student of color can also be a former foster youth and can also be a student with a disability who's experiencing basic needs and security and so forth. And taking this discussion about equity one step further, it's also important that we embrace the concept of equity mindedness. Estella Ben-Simone, who is widely credited for giving us this concept, describes it as being comprised primarily of four characteristics. First is recognizing that equity is a systemic issue. It's not just something that we see, that we experience in post-secondary education, but the same students who are not well served in post-secondary education are also not well served in their K-12 education, in healthcare, in the workforce, in almost every system, social system, a social institution that impacts the lives of themselves and their loved ones. Second, it is important that we see inequity not as simply a student success issue, but actually as an institutional success issue. And that we see inequity not just as an indication of students underperforming, but more so as an indication of institutions underperforming. We also cannot attribute these disparities exclusively to our perceptions of deficits in students' identities, their abilities, and so forth. And finally, we have to be critically reflexive and constantly ask ourselves, what does it mean? What am I doing or what am I not doing that's contributing to inequity? And understanding what inequity is and equity-minded is, it's really important that we do this, but we also need to understand some of the reasons why most equity efforts are actually not successful. And I always like to offer this list of things that I've seen and factors that I've seen and come across in nearly a decade of doing this work with community colleges across the country. And in doing so, there are some that I would like to highlight. Of course, we don't have the time to talk about all of them, but I do want to highlight the ones that are most significant within the context of our conversation today. The first one is the one that's third on the list, deficit perspectives. I often like to think about deficit perspectives as self-fulfilling prophecy. If we believe that the student that we're working with doesn't belong here or is not capable of being successful, then it will have an impact on the ways in which we teach and serve that student. It's also reflected in the vibe and the energy that we convey and in our motivation to go the extra mile to support that student. And whenever I think about deficit perspectives, I find it helpful to reflect back upon my work as an adjunct faculty member at LA Trade Tech College about 15 years ago. And this was at a time when I was teaching Intro to Public Speaking, Thursday evenings, 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. And I can honestly say that at that time, the students who did well in my class were students who I believe would do well. And conversely, students who struggled were usually students that I didn't necessarily believe in or went out of my way to support when they encountered difficulty. And I think we all probably can reflect upon students who we've worked well with and have been more effective with than other students. And I think a lot of what we're experiencing, if we were to really reflect critically upon that situation, so much of that experience and the success of students in working with us is rooted in our perspectives of their capabilities and their success. A second reason I like to highlight is when we have a poor conceptualization of what equity means and how to practice it. Equity is about closing disparities in resources, information, and opportunity. So this means that we cannot give every student the same thing, because that would actually be equality. But equity is about giving students what they need to be successful, which also entails eliminating institutional barriers. And finally, I'd like to spend some time discussing the last point that's presented here: toxic resistance and toxic support. In doing so, I'd like to talk about this taxonomy that Luke and I developed a few years ago to make sense of the range of perspectives we encounter on a regular basis on equity. And the taxonomy has two constructs that you can see here. The first being competence, which is represented at the top with the labels know what to do and don't know what to do. And competence essentially relates to our knowledge and understanding of equity and equity-minded practice. The second construct is motivation, which is represented at the left of the figure, and it's labeled willingness to employ practices and unwillingness to employ practices. So let's start with the box that's labeled KW. It's the box at the top right. This captures the perspective of educators who know what equity-mindedness is and practices it on a regular basis. And we call this group, as some of you know, the choir. And we call them the choir because more often than not, it's the choir that's leading equity efforts and conversations on their campus. Next, we have the allies, who are represented at the top left of the figure. The only thing that separates the allies from the choir is that the allies have not had the coaching, professional development, and opportunity to learn about equity-mindedness and infuse it into their practice with students. But if you give them the opportunity to learn it, they can easily become a part of the choir. And this next group is the resistors. The resistors have not embraced equity-mindedness and do not see it as necessary, and quite frankly, are not motivated to do it. And we find that there are two types of resistors. They're active resistors and passive resistors. Active resistors are the ones who are most vocal and forthcoming about their opposition to equity efforts. Passive resistors are not going to be as vocal and transparent about their opposition, but they are going to avoid any opportunity to be authentically engaged in it. And finally, there's the defiant. These are the folks who have been trained and actually have a good understanding of equity and equity-mindedness. However, they refuse to enact these practices with the students who need the support the most. Now, after presenting this framework, Luke and I got some input from a colleague who told us that the framework was missing a group. And he said, what about the folks who think they're equity-minded, think they're part of the choir, but they have no idea what they're doing? And we call this group the oblivious. And one can become oblivious in one of three ways. First is when we do the work from what we call a savior complex. When we believe that our work is about saving students rather than supporting them and empowering them. Second is when we're not reflective in our work. And this occurs when our words and the values that we espouse are not aligned. And they're not aligned with our actions and the ways in which we teach and serve students. And then finally, there is grandstanding. And grandstanding occurs when our commitment to equity is more about developing a reputation for being equity-minded, advancing our careers and being perceived a certain way by our colleagues, and less so about actually being authentically engaged in equity work and supporting students and helping the institution become more transformational and being able to infuse equity. And so this taxonomy is important because what it allows us to do is to think about and recognize that we have to be targeted and intentional in our messaging when it comes to equity. We cannot take the same approach with every person. So we talk about the 4 E's. We have to empower the choir, because the thing about the choir is that they've already brought in, and in many ways they've already developed some expertise with being able to infuse equity mindedness in their work. So they just need to understand that the work that they're doing is important. It's aligned with what the research says is necessary, and that students benefit from it. The second E is educate. We have to educate the allies, because again, the only thing that separates the choir from the allies is that the allies haven't had the opportunity to build their capacity around equity and equity mindedness. With regard to the passive resistance and the defiant, we have to encourage them. And in particular, we have to encourage them to care, right? They have to see and understand how equity and equity mindedness actually is beneficial not only for students in the institution, but in some ways beneficial to them as well. And then finally, we have to enlighten the oblivious. We have to have difficult, sometimes uncomfortable, but critical conversations, and helping them see the disconnect between the values they espouse and their actions and the ways in which they're working with students, and the ways in which they're engaged in equity efforts. And so with that, I think this is actually a good time for me to pause and check in, ask if there are any questions about what we presented thus far. You can use the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question if there are any questions. Okay, doesn't appear to be any at this time. So we'll continue with the presentation, and we should have some time at the end before we conclude to take any questions that may arise. All right, so we've discussed equity mindedness and the taxonomy and the foundation of the work that we're doing. Now let's transition to the actual practices that we have found to be value added and important when enacted by classified professionals. So a few things that we need to note before we present the practices. First is that everything that we'll present here is informed by our work with more than 100 community colleges over the past nearly a decade, as well as the published research on student equity and student success, with a particular focus on community college students. Second, it's not just about employing strategies. We must employ these strategies from an equity-minded perspective. So in other ways, we don't want to do equity work from a deficit perspective. Third, some of these practices you're going to find are going to be more applicable and more relevant in certain contexts. Say, for example, outreach or counseling or financial aid as examples, while others can be applied more broadly. Next, all of the practices address key constructs of the social ecological outcomes model, which you see at the top right of the slide here. We do not have time to unpack the constructs of this model, but it is the conceptual framework that guides all of the work, all of our assessment work here at SEAL. And then finally, the goal of every strategy that I'll present is to obtain an optimal balance between challenge and support, while also holding students to high expectations and conveying authentic care for them and their success. So let's start with our first practice, is to convey unconditional positive regard. Some of you, particularly those of you who have any background or training in counseling, you probably recognize this concept from Rogerian counseling theory. And the key point here is that when we convey unconditional positive regard, we validate students and communicate a belief that they can be successful regardless of their past experiences, regardless of any past setbacks that they've had or any disappointments that they've had in education. So in order to do this authentically, we have to reject this traditional paradigm of student success, which teaches us that some students are fit for college and belong in college while other students are not. As a part of this, students have to hear on a regular basis, they have to hear messages of validation and support. They have to hear things like you belong here, you can be successful, I'm proud of you, I believe in you. I know things are really difficult right now with the transition to remote learning, but don't give up. You can do this, you can make it through, and I'm here to support you in doing so. Those messages are really important for students to hear, especially during the times in which they encounter barriers and roadblocks and things that would make them want to reconsider if they actually belong in college. And while we do all of this, we have to let students know that we have high expectations of them and that we expect them to be able to meet those expectations and that you'll support them in being able to meet those expectations. Sometimes folks misunderstand equity when we talk about eliminating barriers, when we talk about making it easier for students to be engaged and to do their work. Sometimes that can be misunderstood as trying to coddle students or trying to make things easier for students. And it's not about making the content easier. It's not about making things less rigorous because no one benefits from that. But really it's about eliminating all the stuff that gets in the way that allows students to really be focused on learning and actually demonstrating that they have learned and that they've gained knowledge and that they've gained skills and that they've met the outcomes of certain learning experiences. That's ultimately what it must be about. And then this last point, we have to make sure that in validating students that we don't unintentionally micro-message them. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but essentially we don't want to microaggress students in our attempts to validate them and support them, right? A lot of times, for example, when we compliment students and tell them how well they've done and what a good job they've done, if we're not careful, we can say that in a way that conveys a sense of surprise that students have actually outperformed low expectations that we've had of them. And that doesn't serve anyone well, right? It certainly doesn't serve the student well. So we have to be mindful about, how our message is packaged and making sure that we're aware of the expectations that we have for students. And that, again, and if we hold high expectations, and if that's our default, then we're less likely to microaggress students as we validate them and support them. All right, next. Relationships are the foundation of student support, student services. Relationships that are grounded in trust, mutual respect, and authentic care are the foundation. And we also know from our work that these relationships are actually more likely to be established when educators take on the responsibility of creating the conditions for them to emerge. So some examples of that. In building relationships with students, we have to let them know that we are personally invested in their success. This is one of the most significant predictors of student persistence, is that when students believe that we are authentically invested in them and in their success. And there are several ways that we can do this. For example, we can learn things about the student that has nothing to do with them being a student. And while, some things like their name, of course, hometown, hobbies, activities, special talents, favorite books, movies, and so forth. And some people may see these as trivial details or irrelevant details about students' lives, but we have to recognize that it's this type of information that gives us insight into who students are, and it allows, it can actually enhance our ability to connect with them. In addition, we have to be willing to engage students on both academic and non-academic matters, because it's actually on the academic matters that serves as the foundation on which relationships are formed. We never want to miss opportunities. I know, right now, with the fact that we're 100% working with students remotely, this may not be as salient today, but we have to think about all the times in which we encounter students informally, while we're walking across campus to a meeting, or we run into a student in the parking lot, and so forth. Use those as opportunities to say hello to students, to validate students. It doesn't require a lot of time, but it's those informal encounters that really help to create the conditions upon which relationship building can occur. I know that there are some colleagues who might think and wonder, okay, but what about tough love? And my response to that question is this: I am all about tough love. I'm a very big fan of it. I've benefited personally from tough love, right, at some pretty critical times in my journey. But here's what we have to understand about tough love. It only works when you've actually built a relationship with the student. So if we come out the gates with tough love and, I want to have these very clear boundaries between me and students, not that boundaries aren't important, but if you don't have a relationship with the student, the tough love is not perceived as tough love by the student. Tough love is actually perceived as you're just another educator who's trying to make things more difficult for them. And I know that that's not the message that we want to convey to students. Okay, the next strategy, learning about students' academic strengths. This really comes into play for students who are working, for those of us who are working with students, say in like an outreach capacity or as a mentor or as an advisor. So asking students about the reasons why they are enrolling at Napa Valley College, for example. What is it they're interested in learning? What do they want to do from a career perspective? What are some strengths that they have? What are some concerns that they have? Knowing these things about students can yield incredibly valuable insights that can actually help you be more effective in guiding them. And with your guidance, they can actually make more informed decisions. They can learn about resources that they may not have known about before, and they can actually start to build a network of institutional agents who are available to support them. The fourth practice is to humanize yourself. So what does that mean? So when we are engaged in our qualitative work with students, one thing that we hear on a very regular basis is that to share information about themselves and their journeys, and that these educators are actually easier to connect with and easier to work with and easier to go out and reach out to for support than those who say, aren't willing to do that. They really appreciate hearing stories about how educators who've overcome challenges along their way. And we all know, for example, that many of our students are struggling with basic needs insecurities. Financial challenges are very salient, especially in light of COVID-19, with students losing employment or having family members that are losing employment. And that there are a lot of concerns that get in the way that make it difficult for them to believe that they can actually earn a degree. But I also know that many of us have had similar struggles, and we've had to overcome similar issues in our journeys as well. And students really appreciate hearing about the ways in which we have overcome these challenges because it can be both instructive and motivating for them. Now, a couple things to be mindful of here is that we never want to make claims of equivalency. So it's never, we don't want to convey the message of, well, because I went through this, right? Because I'm Black, for example, then I know what it means to be poor. I know what it means to be such. It's not about making comparisons. It's really about sharing your story and allowing students to glean what they can from the story that you have to share. We also never want to share things that we're not comfortable with others knowing. So, we don't, we never want to preface these statements with, okay, I'm sharing this with you, but I don't want you to share this with anyone else, right? Because that usually doesn't go well. So only share things that you're comfortable with others knowing, including other students and perhaps your colleagues. And the last caveat here, as it relates to humanizing ourselves, understanding what are the policies around, being mandated reporters. So, students have to know that if you are a mandated reporter, what does that mean, and what are the implications of that? What are some things that they can share with you that you can keep confidential, and what are some things that they can share with you that you're required to report? So those things are kind of important to keep in mind and remind students of before you engage in a deep disclosure with them and invite them to do the same thing. All right, next, assessing students' authentic interest in majors, academic programs, and careers. If you're working in a position that requires you to give students information about majors and academic programs, it's important that you do so with the clear understanding of students' interests. So we have to remember that students matriculate to community college. As they matriculate into community colleges, sometimes their goals are misinformed. Sometimes what they choose as majors or what they choose as goals, that they come from information from family or friends or the media or gender societal norms, for example, that we understand that men are less likely to choose careers in the helping professions because they feel that that's is not reflective of masculine norms, and there's certain careers that are feminine careers and so forth. So oftentimes students can be misinformed by those ideas. And so it's important to guide students to people and resources that can actually give them good, transparent, accurate information about employment and about future education. It's helpful if you can engage them in a conversation that gets them to reflect critically and to think about what it is they want to do and what will it take to get there. And so, we see some questions here, things that I've often asked students over the years. When did you first become aware of this career, this major? Do you have some past experiences, perhaps work experience, that have prepared you for this? And to start to direct them to seek good information from other people who are working in that career, perhaps faculty members who are teaching in that major that they're interested in, and help them identify some short-term goals that can help them not only get information, but start to take some positive steps towards achieving their goals. Next, it's really important that we conclude meetings with what we call a clarity check, which is a check for clarity and next steps. Oftentimes, we find ourselves engaged in deep and detailed conversations with students, and we're conveying a lot of information to them that can be very difficult to obtain. And so we want to make sure that we conclude these meetings with a good understanding that students know what information that they have, and more importantly, what they should be doing with the information that you've given them. We also have to recognize that many of our colleges are incredibly bureaucratic, especially right now with everything having to be moved online in a very short amount of time. And we also have to recognize that, many underserved students might not be as forthcoming in asking you to repeat or clarify information because they don't want to reinforce social stereotypes about their readiness for college, their belonging in college, are they smart, and so forth. And so, a clarity check always helps. You can ask them things like, okay, so, what department are you going to contact next? And what is it that you're going to tell them once you get there, right? And once you've completed that step, what is the next thing that you're going to do? So, this information really helps to make sure that students understand what the next steps are, and to make sure that they don't miss anything, and that they haven't misunderstood anything. And also, if it's appropriate, I would follow up with students, send an email or a text if that's appropriate, or your handwritten notes. Sometimes we take notes, sometimes they take notes. And so it's good to actually have access to that information, because 3 days later or a week from now, they may not remember some of the details that you've discussed. Our next strategy is to be proactive and intrusive. Being proactive and being intrusive is directly aligned with an equity-minded approach to serving students, and really underscores the importance of institutional responsibility. Because what it does is it puts the onus on the educator to initiate the communication that's required to get to the core of what students need. This concept of asking for help can be a huge barrier for some students. We really see it with students who believe, that only students who are struggling are the ones who need help and who ask for help. So there can be a lot of reluctance and apprehension to do that. And as educators, we should never hesitate to anticipate what a student may need and proactively provide the type of assistance to students, even before they ask. So remember, for students who are new to post-secondary education, they may not even know what it is that they don't know. So being proactive is really critical. We also have to be mindful of this. When we make referrals, we're not just connecting students to another department or students to an office or a program. We're connecting students to other educators. And hopefully we're connecting them with equity-minded educators who can serve and support them with the same energy and the same integrity that you would support the student with. And we also have to recognize this, that there can be other students who we work with who've been successful. We call them near peers. And these are students who can provide guidance and support because sometimes peers are actually better positioned to support students than we are because there isn't a perceived barrier or a power dynamic that exists between the relationships between students and students. Okay, and our last strategy is we have to continue to build our capacity to be equity-minded educators. So, pursuing professional learning opportunities, whether they be online or in person, once, we can, things return to a point where we can do in-person professional development. It's only going to give us more sight into our work. It's only going to give us more strategies. And it's important and essential that we continue to build our capacity to do so. And with that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. Just a quick summary again of the support practices that we talked about today. And with that, we have about 10 minutes or so for questions and thoughts and reflections, if there are any. And again, before we conclude, I want to thank you all so much for allowing me to engage you on this important topic. Any questions or thoughts or reflections or comments?
This was great material. I really thank you for presenting this. Very well put together, very thought-provoking.
Thank you. So the name I see is Star.
Star, yeah, I work in admissions and records.
Awesome, thank you, Star.
You're very welcome, thank you.
Yep, and thank you for the work that you do on behalf of students.
I appreciate that.
Yep. Any others?
I have a quick question. In terms of how we as an institution assess our effectiveness in our practices, how would you suggest we do that? What would that look like, and what's the barometer that we can say how I know each as individuals we can take that on ourselves, which is obviously what I encourage of all the people that work in my area, but how can we assess that? What would be an effective way to do that?
Thank you, Jessica, for your question. May I ask, what area do you oversee?
I oversee the admissions and records, welcome center, and student life.
Okay, so you have some of the most critical areas, right? I think it would be important that you talk with students, right, or engage in some type of qualitative assessment. I think that's really helpful. If there are short surveys that you can do, these can easily actually be local. Surveys that are locally developed within your department. Maybe you could do that in collaboration with the Office of Institutional Research if they have the capacity to do it. But I think it's important that we consistently reach out to students, that we're asking them, what has your experience been? How have you been supported? What are some ways that we can get better at providing what you need? Those conversations with students are really important. But I also think we have to take the information and we have to share it with our staff and make sure that they're getting the feedback as well. And that we're doing it's better if we could do it in a way that's not perceived as evaluative or punitive to staff, but do it with the understanding that this is about professional development. This is about increasing our effectiveness as a department, because we have, and I think you can say this, we have some of the most critical areas when it comes to forming those first impressions of the campus for students. And, if we don't get it right here, then a lot of students won't make it past here. And, I think when we approach it with that perspective, then, our staff, I should say the professionals in your area, can be more authentically engaged. And I also think it's good if you start to, I think folks get nervous when I say this, but we have to start, holding folks accountable for practicing their work in an equity-minded way, right? And by accountability, I don't mean that, you are writing folks up and things like that, but when you're having evaluation meetings with your staff, having a questionnaire or having some kind of metrics that talks about their enactment of equity-mindedness, I think is important. And then again, the main thing, I think, especially in the beginning here, in order to get buy-in, is to let them know that, hey, we're not here, I'm not doing this to penalize you, but it's all about improving institutional effectiveness. It's all about improving the effectiveness of our department, which starts with improving the effectiveness of every individual that's involved here. But yeah, Jessica, your area when it comes to underserved students is, and I've worked with a lot of campuses, as you know, it's one of the most critical areas. It's right up there with counseling and financial aid. So, you all play a key role in being able to provide students with a good welcoming matriculation experience. It all starts with you all.
Wonderful. And I have another quick question following up on all of your great statements about some things that we could focus on. And one specific question I have is, in terms of a survey, we have done several. We have a focus group. Currently, right now, I've got an online focus group or focused on technology, but I don't have one that's focused on service delivery. And so I maybe that's something that we could look at. But in terms of surveying students with an actual survey, do you think it's better to have it right then and there in the context of the interaction? Like basically say, here, please complete the survey? Or do you think, where do we get the most authentic responses? Or just a random, once a semester, we send out a, how was your service sort of survey over the course of their experience? Or, help me with kind of what your experience shows as the most effective time frame to getting that best feedback.
Yeah, well, the closer they are to the experience, the better.
Yeah, that's
right?
What I would
So
assume.
if you could survey them, say, within 24 hours, and if you have two things here, it would be important if you can to disaggregate the data. So we know who our disproportionately impacted students are. So, I know I've done a lot of work with the campus, and we know that African-American students, for example, are a disproportionately impacted population. So being able to not only collect the data, but be able to disaggregate it, and that, in this case, by race and ethnicity would be important. And if you can do something that's easy and quick for them to fill out. So maybe if they can get a text message and it's, please rate your experience, or you're using simple Likert scale questions. And then maybe having something where they can do something open-ended at the end is really valuable. But I would, and this is my personal preference, so to speak, I wouldn't frame it as a customer service survey, but I would frame it as an assessment of students' experiences, which is different, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think most educators don't see themselves as people who are selling things, right? Mm-hmm. Most educators see themselves as serving and supporting students.
Support, right.
And so you want the assessment to be framed in that language, so that, again, you have the greatest likelihood of buy-in once you have the information.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Yep. Any other questions? And it could be questions, thoughts, reflections. I see Robin here. Robin, I'm so sorry I blanked on your name. It's more your last name. So my apologies for that. My sincerest apologies.
You know, half of the state of, California and all these other states. You're good.
Thank you.
You are forgiven.
Thank you.
I do have a question, and I'm sorry, Frank, I did get a phone call that I had to take just for a moment, so I stepped away. And you may have answered this, but, and it was in your presentation, but how do you influence naysayers?
Oh, yes. Yeah, the resistors.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's important to recognize why do people resist when it comes to equity? And in my experience, there's sort of like two big reasons, although I don't think that this covers everything. But the first reason is that we have to recognize we're asking people to think about their work differently, and in some cases to do their work differently. And maybe they feel like they're not trained to do it that way. Like there's a lack of confidence because of they don't want to be perceived as incompetent or not capable. So instead of saying, hey, I need some additional support with knowing how to do my work from it, how do I run the Welcome Center and work with students in a more equity-minded way? That can be and feel more vulnerable than, this is stupid, I don't really want to do this. Why is this important? We're hand-holding these students. I've been working here for 20 years, and there's a lot of students who I've worked well with, and the ones who I haven't worked well with, it's not my fault. So I think folks can get defensive because of that, because they feel like they're going to be asked to do something that they really don't have the capacity to do. So part of the messaging is, this is what we have to do. We have to do our work better. And this is how we're going to support you in building the skills and getting the resources that you need to do it better, right? A lot of times we miss that second piece of the message. The other part is this. Sometimes we have, and I think this is particularly salient with our colleagues who identify as white, or not racial and ethnic minorities. There's an assumption that, well, I'm not a person of color, so I don't really have anything to contribute to this conversation around, how to support students of color. And that's a mistake. So we have to always frame it with saying it doesn't matter if you are a person of color or not. You can support students of color, but you have to do it with an understanding and appreciation of their lived experience, right? So obviously, it's like, yeah, we don't expect you to be a person of color if you're not a person of color, but we expect you to, learn about the students who you're serving, have some understanding of their lived experiences, right? Learn what it means to be culturally affirming. But a lot of times, and I bear some responsibility for this, we're not as transparent about those two things up front. And we're not proactive about those concerns up front. And I think it just gives people an opportunity to kind of further entrench themselves and feel as though, well, they're not speaking to me. This is not about me, so I'm going to disengage. Or, wow, this means I'm going to really have to retool, and I don't really have the time to do that, or I don't really have the capacity to do that, so I'm going to disengage for that reason. I think those are two really big barriers to buy in on this.
And I just want to mention that what you present really has an impact on my work in regards to student discipline, because I get students referred to me, and for various reasons, plagiarism, cheating, misconduct. And over the past semester, I've had several students, and I talk about the issue, but then I go deeper and say, tell me what you like about Napa College. Tell me what I can do to help you, and share your story with me. And I always find it interesting that students kind of are taken back that I ask them, why would you care about my story? Why would you care about me? Why, you know, because I asked them what's their hobbies, what do you like? What do you like about your programs and your teachers? And truly I'm trying to connect with them on a deeper level than just like student conduct. And I've had such a large response from students, whether it be like thank you emails, like I came in for trouble and I left with like resources and help and support, and so that, you know, that piece has been it's, you know, I come from a counseling background, and but also, you know, learning and understanding and embracing, you know, equity mindedness at a larger scale. It's great that I can use and infuse that in the work I do with students on a behavioral level. And so it's been very positive. And I just want to thank you for the continuous training. It's been extremely helpful for me personally as I work with students and my colleagues. So thank you. And I know there's another question out there.
Yeah. Thank you, Robin. I'm happy to hear that. You know, I mean, that's why we do it, right? Is to support colleges and support our colleagues and being better at doing what they're doing in a way that serves students well. I mean, that's ultimately what it's about.
There's
so
one more question out there.
Yeah, it's about explaining equity mindedness. And if it's okay, I'm going to go back a few slides because I think we went over this fairly quickly. Bear with me. Here we go. Right. So when we talk about equity mindedness, it's really about a mindset and a perspective that starts with you asking not what's wrong with the student, right? Or not does the student belong here, but if things aren't going well, what are we doing as an institution that's not allowing things to go well, right? Or of course the student belongs here, but what are some strengths and some assets that this student brings to this experience that I can leverage as an educator to support them, right? So the way that I like to contrast equity mindedness is to refer back to what we call a traditional paradigm of student success. So like when I was in graduate school, the things that I learned pretty early on were, okay, a successful student does these things. You know, a successful student shows up every day, they take notes, they perform well on the tests and assignments and so forth. And all of the students who don't fall in line with that perspective, something is wrong with them. They don't belong here. They're not going to make it. They're not going to be successful. So don't even waste your time on those students, right? And equity mindedness is about saying, no, wait a minute. Every student, right? Particularly a student, when we're talking about working in an open access community college, every student is here for a reason. Every student brings something valuable and important. How do I tap into what that is? And how do I do it in a way that not only allows the student to benefit, but allows our institution to be better? And so really, if we think about equity mindedness in its most general sense, it's first starting with the question of, you know, how can I best meet the student where she is and bring them along, and in bringing them along, eliminate the crap that gets in the way of her success. And that's, I would say equity mindedness is certainly something easier to describe than it is to practice, because it requires us to practice it intentionally. And if your graduate experience was anything like mine, particularly at the master's level, you know, I was programmed to think very differently than what equity mindedness requires us to think. And so it's about reprogramming what it means to be an educator in ways that's going to be value added and beneficial for students. So I know that was a long answer to, you know, a fairly straightforward question, but I hope that helps. Any other questions? Okay, I know we are about a minute past our time. I want to thank you all again for your participation. I want to wish everyone much success as we wrap up, what was a very difficult semester, I think, for all of us, including our students. And most importantly, I hope everyone stays safe, and I hope that your loved ones are healthy and safe as well. And I look forward to seeing you all again, whether it's in one of the other workshops that we have going today online or in person soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you. Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.